Today, I'm talking to a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She has written a riveting book based on 4 decades of research that confirms her ancestral ties and sheds a bright light on what it means to be a Black woman in America and to reclaim her heritage. The book is Reclamation, and its author, Gayle Jessup White, joins me coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
My guest today is Gayle Jessup White. She is the Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at Montecito, Thomas Jefferson's legendary estate. A former award-winning television reporter and anchor, Gayle is a direct Jefferson descendant and is related to 2 well-documented families enslaved in Montecito, the Hemings and the Hubbards. Her new book is Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and Descendants Search for Her Family's Lasting Legacy. Good morning and welcome to the show, Gayle.
Good morning. Welcome, Sam. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Super excited to sit down with you. I don't think I know anyone that's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, so this is quite an honor for me. And I know in the book you describe yourself as the 5 times great-granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson. And you start the book by explaining how you learned about this connection. So tell us briefly, how did you learn that you are a descendant of Thomas Jefferson?
Well, that's briefly, I don't know if I can do that, but but I will. So I grew up, Areva, in Washington, D.C. It's my hometown. I love that city. I live in Richmond, Virginia, about 2 hours from Washington, but my heart will always belong to that city. I grew up at a time when D.C. was majority Black. That's changed now, but I grew up with in a very solid middle-class background, which gave me a very solid id. It was so solid, in fact, and so Black that I didn't realize that I was part of a marginalized community. And so when I turned 13 years old, this kind of awareness, this happens among young people, this kind of awareness sort of came into my life, which I explain in the book, which actually happened there on the West Coast. And I brought some burdens with me back home after an experience I had there. And at the time, there was a lot happening in my life. In addition to my sister, who's 20 years older than I, coming back into my life after she'd been living in Asia for 2 years. She was visiting our home and having a conversation with my dad at a point where I was a little tired of listening to her because she's a big talker. And I was in the kitchen in the refrigerator looking for a snack. And I heard my sister say, my sister's very grand, she's very glamorous, she's very dramatic. And I heard my sister say, and I said, I'm descended from Thomas Jefferson. Well, this perked my attention. Mind you, this is decades ago.
Right.
So in my 13-year-old brain, I couldn't imagine how I, a young Black girl, could be related to Thomas Jefferson because we had not been taught that Jefferson owned people. During his lifetime, Jefferson owned more than 600 people. I only learned that recently as an adult, as a seasoned adult. Excuse me. But as a child, I hadn't been taught that. Many people were not. So I set about trying to learn, first of all, what the circumstances were where Janice was making this announcement. And then, of course, how we could have been related to Jefferson. And that started me on a lifetime journey trying to put the pieces together, which ultimately led me to Monticello, which is where I work today, my ancestral home.
So what was that moment like when you got confirmation that this is not just, something my sister in her grand way was making up?
Well, it was decades, literally decades, and that I learned that my sister wasn't making it up. Let me back up a little bit. My sister, I finally found after having lots of conversation with my dad, who was 6'2", had red hair and freckles. If you know about Jefferson, he was 6'2", had red hair and freckles. Wow. So there was sort of this physical confirmation of it. I also learned that my dad's mother was from Charlottesville. Her name name was Eva Robinson. Sometimes she went by Eva Taylor. Jefferson, of course, was from Charlottesville, Albemarle County specifically, which is where Monticello is. All of these, there was a lot of evidence, but it was all circumstantial. It was all supposition. And it was all based on a story passed down to my sister from my grandmother's half-sister, a woman we called Aunt Peachy. Her real name was Virginia Robinson, but she was known as Aunt Peachy in the family. Aunt Peachy was not only uneducated, she could not read, write, or spell her own name. But Aunt Peachy knew one thing and emphasized one thing throughout her life to my sister. You're descended from Thomas Jefferson, she would tell my sister. I'm not, because she was the half-sister of my grandmother, who was the Jefferson descendant. You're descended from Thomas Jefferson, I'm not. My grandmother died before any of us knew her. So all those stories were lost, save for Aunt Peachy. So were it not for Aunt Peachy passing that information to Jan and my eavesdropping as a 13-year-old girl on a conversation between Janice and my dad, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But still, I had no idea what the connection was. I assumed it was through Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson because I didn't know the history. I didn't know otherwise. Like so many Americans, I didn't know my own history. I didn't know enough about Black history, even though I was a student at Howard University, the premier Black institution in the country. And I learned a lot, but there's so much that we don't know.
Make that connection for us, Gayle, the Sally Hemings connection, because it's very recent that we've even started having these conversations about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and I'm not sure people still know it or believe, what that connection is between the two of them. So through your research, what did you learn?
So now it's not through my research that I learned about Sally Hemings. Through my research, I learned that Sally Hemings is in fact my relative, but she is my 4 times aunt, great aunt. Her brother was my 3 times great grandfather. His name was Peter Hemings. And these are the stories we tell at Monticello, and these are the stories I tell in my book. So that was the eureka moment when I discovered that, in fact, it was Peter Hemings who is my relative, not Sally, or my ancestor, not Sally Hemings, not a direct ancestor. So back to your question about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. Sally Hemings was among several people Jefferson inherited from his father-in-law, whose name was John Wales. That sounds bizarre to us in the 21st century, that people could have been bequeathed, gifted, sold, really murdered. Whatever you wanted to do to your property, you could. In this case, Jefferson inherited people. Among them was a woman named Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings had several children, including a child named Sally and Peter, who was my ancestor. Jefferson's wife died. As it turns out, these children, Sally Hemings and Peter, among others, were the children of John Wales, Thomas Jefferson's wife's father.
So his father.
So Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's wife, whose name was Martha, it's hard to keep up, but were half-sisters.
Okay.
Sally Hemings and Jefferson's
John Wales, Sally.
By John Wales, you got it.
Okay, got it.
Jefferson's wife dies. He goes to, and it was horrible for him. After 10 years, she dies as a result of childbirth. He was so bereft, and eventually goes on to Paris, where he is, or to France, and lives in Paris, where he's minister to France. And he takes his eldest daughter, Martha, with him. Later, he brings another daughter, Mariah, to Europe with him because he wants to have his daughters near because of another loss. And the person who traveled with Mariah was Sally Hemings, who at that time was 14 years old. She traveled as a maid. She was sent to Europe to care for Mariah, who was just a couple of years older. They were approximately the same age. And it was there in Paris that Jefferson and Sally Hemings began their connection. I don't like to call it a relationship because we don't know.
He started having sex with her.
Yes. And so I call it relations. They started having sex.
Well, today we'd call it sexual molestation of a minor, but okay.
But at that time, he owned her. So, it's all horrific. No matter what label you put on it, it's horrific. Okay. However, this is what I like to tell people about Sally Hemings. So Jefferson wanted Sally Hemings to come back to Europe, to America with him. Mm-hmm. She demurred. She didn't want to. She could have stayed free in Paris. So she negotiated with him. Mm-hmm. At this point, she was 16 years old. She negotiated freedom for their children and privileges for herself if she agreed to come back to the States with him. And he did. He granted those privileges to her. It's important for people to recognize that in that moment in time, Sally Hemings, a 16-year-old, she would have been considered a woman back then, a 16-year-old young person, negotiated with one of the most influential men of his era, privileges for herself and their unborn children. She practiced her own agency. And I'd like to emphasize this because I don't want to say she had power, but she exercised an element of influence over this man that gave their children, they had 6 together, 4 who survived into adulthood, freedom, manumission, a leg up in life.
Was he willing to do that? Is the story because he loved her, or why was he?
We have no idea why he did it. All we know. There are no documents. There's nothing written down that said, where Thomas Jefferson says, "Sally, I love you," nothing like that. But what we do know is that their 4 adult children, once they turned 21, and they weren't enslaved until they turned 21, but they were either allowed to walk away from the plantation or they were manumitted in his will. And that Sally Hemings, upon Jefferson's death in 1826, was given her time. And what that meant is she wasn't officially freed, but she lived as a free woman.
Well,
so take a look at what you will.
I want to go back, Gayle. So when Jefferson returns to the U.S., Sally returns. Does she return to that plantation that Jefferson owned? And what was their relationship like then? Was she still treated like the maid to his daughter, Mariah?
No, she cared for him. She, according to their son, Madison, who wrote a memoir back in the 1876, she was responsible for raising the children who were allowed to stay with their mother. And on the plantation at Monticello, or on any plantation, children went to work at the age of 8, 9, and 10. But their children were allowed to stay with her. And she took care of his wardrobe, which meant she took care of the space, his bedroom, and the space in his home. And she sewed his clothes and repaired his clothes. She was a seamstress and made a home for him. What we would have called her today as a homemaker.
Did he remarry after Martha died?
He never remarried. He never remarried. He promised, according to people who were around Martha Jefferson's deathbed, including Elizabeth Hemings, Sally Hemings' mother, she extracted from him a promise that he would never remarry, and he did not.
And so now we know this relationship between Sally Hemings and Jefferson.
Right.
What did people know at the time? At the time, you said she was his wardrober, she was his seamstress, she was a homemaker, but was it openly known that they had kids together and she was a part of his life in some kind of relationship?
Yeah. So there was a journalist named James Callender, and he was a tool of Thomas Jefferson for a while in the campaign for his first presidential campaign. And upon Jefferson's success, this man Callender expected to get a plum position, government position, post office position. Those were great, well-paid spots at the time. And Jefferson didn't. He just ignored Callender. So Callender said, okay, I'm just going to disclose to the public that you have this liaison with an enslaved woman, and he called her Dusky Sally, and it was published in the newspapers here in Richmond, which is where I live now, as I mentioned earlier. And so, yes, the public knew, and it was a scandal at the time that Jefferson ignored, and that he was able to manage to overcome because he went on to win his second campaign for the presidency. So yes, it was known. It's documented. It was even in a poem. and there are cartoons from the era of Jefferson and pictures of or images of Sally Hemings, what people imagined she looked like.
What about Jefferson's kids with Martha? How many kids did they have together?
I think they had 6 children, but only 2 survived into adulthood. Martha, who was my 4 times great-grandmother, and Mariah. When Mariah died at 25 as a result of childbirth as well, like her mother. And Martha Jefferson went on to have 13 children with her cousin. Cousins often married each other then. 13 children, 12 of whom survived into adulthood. Her husband was a man named Thomas Mann Randolph. And 2 of the children fought hard to protect the legacy of Jefferson. So when the idea of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson having this liaison was brought up among historians at the time, people who had come to visit Monticello to make record of what the author of the Declaration of Independence was like and what he looked like, 2 of the children would deny it. One grandson in particular, who was also my ancestor, would deny it. In fact, if you got a chance to visit Monticello, you'll see that we have preserved a room there. We have an exhibition called The Life of Sally Hemings, where his grandson, Jefferson's grandson, said she lived. And it was supposed to have been a dark, sooty room, separate from the main part of the house, attached, but quite a distance from the main part of the house. So they were very protective of Jefferson's legacy, claiming that there were cousins, the Carr brothers, who probably fathered Sally Hemings' children. But we know from a 1998 study called the Foster DNA study that they did not. The likely father was Jefferson. And I write about that in the book. But what's important about this, I think, is that it's not the focus is not just Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. I'm not descended from Sally Hemings. I'm descended from another Hemings woman and another Jefferson descendant. I'm descended from Thomas Jefferson's great-great-grandson. His name was Moncure Robinson Taylor, which is why my grandmother called herself Taylor. And I'm descended from Peter Hemings, who was Sally Hemings' brother. Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law, as I mentioned earlier, John Wales, had relations after 3 of his wives died with Elizabeth Hemings. So that's one Hemings generation. Thomas Jefferson had relations with Sally Hemings, and they had children. That's another generation. Jefferson's, you asked me about Mariah, which is a great question. Thomas Jefferson's daughter's husband, so his son-in-law, after Mariah dies, Jefferson's son-in-law takes up with another Hemings woman, and we think they had children together. And then Thomas Jefferson's great-great-grandson, my great-grandfather, Moncure Robinson Taylor, takes up with a Hemings woman, my great-grandmother, whose name was Rachel, and they have children together. So that's 4 generations of Jefferson-related family members and Hemings family members having relations. That tells you how entangled those families were, how close those families were, how they're related by blood, they're kin, but yet they were owned, the Hemingses were owned by these people, by these patriarchs. And what happened to Monticello was not unique. Right. Was happening all over the South. The difference is that Jefferson kept copious notes. I like to say he was anal. He wrote down everything. So we have lots of information about it. And in addition to that, there's been this interest in him for hundreds of years now. So we have letters preserved at Monticello, at UVA, and other institutions in the country where we can actually, researchers can actually read what people wrote about him. They can read in newspapers, as I mentioned earlier, about James Callender. During my research, I could read letters where I found my Black ancestors mentioned in my white ancestors' letters.
Wow.
So this symbolizes, for us, I think, my family symbolizes all of our experiences and our ancestors' experiences in America. I just happen to know mine.
Did you find anything in those letters? I know you said you didn't see anything where it says Thomas Jefferson, said to Sally Hemings, "I love you." But
Right.
were there anything? Was there anything in the letters that spoke to a relationship beyond just sexual?
Between Hemings and Jefferson?
Yes.
No.
No, nothing in the letters. What about the ancestors now? So, are you in contact with any of the white ancestors of Thomas Jefferson?
You mean the descendants?
The descendants of Thomas.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I have great relationships with several of the descendants, white descendant family members.
So you talked about some of those descendants who were very protective of his legacy.
Sure.
And tried to deny that relationship with Sally Hemings. Like, if we think about modern day today, those descendants, those that you're close with, maybe some that you're not so close with, what's their position on those relationships between the Jeffersons and the Hemings?
Well, it depends on who they are. There's some people who are still in denial, who still don't accept that Jefferson had relations with the woman he enslaved. And then there's some who have for decades at this point fought for recognition and acknowledgement of those descendants. Obviously, the ones with whom I have relationships are very supportive and want the truth to be exposed, as we do at Monticello. We have something called the Getting Word Oral History Project, where we had two researchers, principally Cinder Stanton, who's my mentor, and the late Diane Swan Wright. When Cinder's white, Diane was black, traveled crisscross the country, collectively thousands of miles, collecting stories from descendants about their ancestors, about what they knew about enslavement at Monticello, because it's essential that we tell these complete stories about American history. Black people, marginalized people, have been written out of American history. How many people know what happened to Asians in this country? The Chinese Exclusion Act. How many people know about the Chinese Exclusion Act? How many people know about something called Operation Wetback, which is so offensive just in its name, where Hispanics were moved out of the country by President Eisenhower? People don't know these stories, and we need to share these stories because they're all part of American history and they all help us grow.
I know I read that it took you several decades to do this research. What were some of the major roadblocks you ran into in terms of trying to, formulate this history?
So, first and foremost, my ancestors weren't considered human. So there are no birth certificates. There are no death certificates. There are few records. There's nothing documented until 1870, that first census, when Black people were counted as human. So the biggest roadblock was that our people weren't considered people.
Right.
No documentation. No documentation. For the most part, we have this oral history. And as I told someone in a presentation yesterday, it's so important that we save pieces of paper. It's so important that we save letters. If you ever come to my home, you'll see that it's pretty minimalist. I don't like a lot of stuff. I like art and pretty things, but not too much of it. But I hoard paper. I have boxes and boxes and boxes of notes. One of the reasons I was able to document so much in this story, in my memoir, was because I kept a diary. I've had diaries since I was a kid. I can't tell you how horrible it is reading what you've written, the musings of an 11, 12-year-old kid, but I had to do that in order to generate and to trigger my memory, and I'm so glad I did.
Right.
It's important that we save those things because they're invaluable. They tell our story, and we didn't have that. For so long, we didn't have that.
And you mentioned DNA testing. At what point was DNA testing used to, verify some of these family connections?
So in 1998, there was a big study done through UVA, I believe it was, called the Foster Study, Dr. Eugene Foster. And in that process, he had a descendant of Hemings and a Jefferson family member. Jefferson doesn't have any male family descendants tested. And it was determined that the people the family members said Father Jefferson's children could not have. They traced it. They didn't trace it to Jefferson because they don't have Jefferson's DNA. They eliminated the people who could have fathered the children. In addition to that, having the DNA evidence demonstrate that it was likely Jefferson. We also have circumstantial evidence. Every time Jefferson returned home from being in Washington, D.C., where he was president, 9 months later, Sally Hemings would have a baby. So, and then, of course, we have the own story from their son, Madison, who said that he was Jefferson's child, Jefferson and Sally Hemings' child, and that he and his siblings were the only children that Jefferson had with an enslaved person. So we do have evidence, and we have DNA, we have some documentary evidence, and then we have the circumstantial evidence. And it's the same thing in my family. I have some of that as well.
I know in the book you talk about meeting a distant cousin that wasn't so pleasant. What was that like? So I've met a lot of cousins. I have had a relationship with one, and it started out in a very hopeful fashion. I don't know what our status is now, but she was very helpful in moving the story along. I think that white people have to be very careful, even if they mean well, in how they discern and disseminate stories about Black people. I think there is a huge risk of cultural appropriation in the way white people interpret stories of Black people, especially enslaved. It's a sensitive area. Right. And I write about that in the book. Right. Okay, and without giving the whole story away from the book, that was a part of the contention with this cousin.
Without giving the whole story away.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's interesting, and people definitely want to make sure you read that, because you're right, and you read stories about Black families meeting their white relatives, whether it's cousins or some other kind of relative, and there's a lot to negotiate in those relationships.
I agree with you. There is a lot to negotiate, and that's something worth talking about and exploring.
Yeah, there's a lot to negotiate. Just learning your history, what has this done for you? Because, many of us can go onto these websites that are available now and try to trace our ancestors. Many people talk about they found distant relatives using some of these, websites and different apps that are available. But for you, having lived this, having, gone through in a much more in-depth way than most people will ever do to learn about their history, how has it changed you as a person?
Areva, it has changed my life. We are the sum total of our ancestors, of our history. And I know my history. I said I grew up with a strong id, and I did. But we all have doubts. We all have questions. We all wonder who our people were. And I know who my people were. And I'm a stronger person for it. I understand why I do certain things now. I know that my ancestors did some of those things. They were strong people, and they were dignified. And I know now why I respond in certain ways to things, because my ancestors did. I feel whole. Now, I'm not a young person, so it took me a long time to get to this place. But I've never felt happier, more fulfilled, or stronger in my entire life, more confident. All of that came about because I know who my people were and the kind of people they were. Yeah. So it was life-changing.
What was the most painful thing, Gayle? Because whenever we revisit stories about slavery, and the abuse that we know so many enslaved women, Black women, suffered, those are very painful stories, oftentimes to relive. What was the most painful part for you of discovering this history?
It's really difficult to say. It's such a loaded history, and we do have generational trauma. So there are many moments in the book that were very painful for me. It was also cathartic writing this book. I would not like to present my life as ideal. It was not idyllic. There was a lot of discomfort there, and I write about that, and I write about that very honestly. I would like people to understand the motivation for tracing this history. It wasn't just because I wanted to find out whether I was related to Thomas Jefferson, and the greatest reward in it was not discovering that I was related to Thomas Jefferson, and I explained that and why it was important. But for us, this generational trauma can be an obstacle, can be inhibiting, can stop us from growing. And so it's important to acknowledge it and face it and challenge it and then rise above it. So sure, there was a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain in our history, but we can rise above that pain and be better people as a result of it.
Yeah. What do you want the biggest takeaway, Gayle, from the book to be?
First of all, I want people to acknowledge that our ancestors were human beings and to treat history in a fair, balanced way, recognizing the contributions of enslaved people. Capitalism was built on the backs of enslaved people. We were not a monolith moving through history. We were contributors in history. So that's number one. Number two, as a result of that, I would like people to see the descendants of enslaved as human beings. When that begins to happen, then some of the abuse and exploitation and marginalization of our people will end. I would also like for people to be inspired, very much to be inspired, to talk to their elders, to get as much information as they can before it's gone. I just learned yesterday that one of my 95-year-old cousins, and I have many nonagenarians in my family, passed away over the weekend. Fortunately, I met her before she died and learned so much from her and from her son, my cousin, the one who's my age, who's had many conversations with her about our history. Capture that before it's gone, because when they're gone, there's nothing you can do to get it back. Their voices will be gone. So I want people to be inspired. I would like people to be inspired to learn their own histories and then pass it on to their children.
Yeah, such great advice about that oral history. And obviously Aunt Peachy played such an important role in your family in passing down that oral history. One of the things that comes up, Gayle, when we have the conversation about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson is that conversation about reparations. Where do you stand on that? Having now done this history, having now known that Sally Hemings, and you knew it, like you said before, but, really confirming that her kids are as deserving as the, kids that Sally had with Martha in terms of whatever wealth he had that was passed down generationally.
Well, so Jefferson died in debt. He didn't have any wealth. Monticello had to be sold, and all the people he owned, not all of them, but most of the people he owned, including my great-great-great-grandfather, were sold on the West Lawn, which is the iconic view that you see on the back of the nickel with the dome, was sold in January 1827, 6 months after Jefferson died on July 26th is my birthday, July 4th, 1826. So he died in debt. There was nothing to pass on. His daughter, Martha, the only one to survive into mature age, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, lived from pillar to post after Jefferson died, and her husband died as well. However, there is an obligation. We can talk about reparations in a couple of ways. We can talk about them in a monetary way, and we can talk about them in a truth-telling way. In a truth-telling way, we can't stop. There's not enough educators can do to tell the truth. There's a big conversation going on now about critical race theory. In the state where I live, there's a new governor now who is one of his first mandates was that critical race theory won't be taught to school children. Well, guess what? It's not. It's a law school curriculum. It's not taught to children. However, when people think of critical race theory, they think about teaching what some would consider divisive information. It's not. It's our history. So part of reparations needs to be to tell the full stories, to stop hiding from the truth, to stop feeling that we're not tough enough to take it. What, our children, are we such a weak nation that we can't acknowledge what we've done as human beings? No, we grow from that. Monetary reparations, that's a tall order. But something needs to be done for people who lost so much as a result of our ancestors being used as if they were animals, never being paid for their service. Bring it up to the 20th century for redlining, for people losing their homes. Just today, it was reinforced that here in Richmond, Virginia, not a very large city, back in the 1960s, 20,000 Black people were displaced because of so-called urban renewal. And that happened all over the country. And there are people still alive and their descendants, that's a generation ago, their descendants who never recovered from that loss. There were homes and businesses lost as a result. There needs to be recovery for those people. Right. We need to do something as a country to acknowledge how we marginalized people, disregarded, disrespected, and separated them from their rights. We're only learning about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. How many people didn't know that we bombed our own people in this country and killed hundreds of people? Yes, there needs to be reparation for that.
Yeah, no, I think I love what you said. The first part of reparations is just being honest about the history. And I would like to think we're tough enough that we can handle the truth.
Of course.
That we can, face what the real horrors of this country have been, and then move forward trying to correct those. But thank you so much, Gayle, for doing your part, sharing your family history, something so personal, being willing to share it in your book, Reclamation. Great book. Want to make sure everyone, goes out, picks it up. It's Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a descendant's search for her family's lasting legacy. And thank you for encouraging us to keep telling those oral stories. They are so, so, so important. And those journals. I have been keeping one myself for a very long time. Really important way to memorialize and to pass on that history, because your memory will fade. But
exactly.
Those diaries, and now they can be electronic. They don't have to be the old-fashioned book that I handy little journal that I keep next to me. But there's so many ways to tell that history. And thanks for you telling yours and sharing yours with us, Gayle. Pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much. I totally enjoyed it. Very thought-provoking. I really appreciate you. Okay,
take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. I want to thank Gayle for joining me. Boy, I can't even think about what it must have taken to go back and to, do the kind of research that was necessary to learn her family's history, then to be willing to share it. And that's the good, the bad, and the ugly, because all of our histories has, so many layers and so much complexity. But I do want to thank her, and make sure you pick up this book. It's an incredible book. I've heard so many stories about Sally Hemings. I've been fascinated with this. I don't know if it's a love affair, but some kind of relationship that she had with Thomas Jefferson, where she birthed, as Gayle shared with us, 6 children, 4 who lived to become adults. I think that's such fascinating history, and we should be telling the history in this country of Thomas Jefferson without telling the history of this Black woman, Sally Hemings, and her siblings and her children and her offsprings as well. Just some words to live by before I get out. The history of the world is not complete until your story is told. You may not have the courage, you may not even have the desire or will to write your family histories into a book the way that Gayle Jessup Wright did with respect to her history, but we all have a story to tell. Make sure you're telling that story, share it with your family members, because one day in the future, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, hundreds of years from now, somebody's going to want to know what your life was like. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe, wear your mask, get your booster, and remember, we're all in this together.